Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second session of the workshop, the European Union between crises to be faced and institutions to be reformed. This second session deals with the current economic challenges to European integration. After having been a no issue for over a decade, euro area inflation is now undoubtedly a most important challenge. Just to remember some figures, Eurozone headline inflation fell from 1.3% in 2019 to 0.3% on average in 2020. It rose to 5% in December 2021. Recent assessments point to the pandemic shock as the critical driver of these changes in the level and volatility of inflation. Since February 2022, Russia's war in Ukraine has increased pressure, leading to a 10% headline inflation last September. On top of this, current assessments point to emerging stagflationary scenarios and weakening overall financial conditions. Therefore, a pressing issue for the ECB will be facing this inflationary pressure without further weakening financial condition and even triggering a full-fledged financial crisis. I leave the floor to Hans Helmut for his welcome remarks and introduce today's speakers who will guide us in navigating these uncharted inflationary waters.
Okay, thank you very much, Claudia. Great pleasure for us to cooperate with you here. Basically, I don't have a role. There's no need for presenting any of our distinguished speakers. It's a little bit like bringing or carrying coal to Sheffield. So let me do it nonetheless a little bit. And now I present our speakers in the order of their presentation. We will start off with Frank Smets. Frank is renowned for having developed the working horse model, which central banks use all over the world. And that's work which he did in the early 2000s, and it's still used in any central bank. He has been very important for the European Central Bank, where he has had many important roles. He was the Director General Economics, Director General Research. He was an advisor to President Draghi in a very crucial and important time. He was cooperating on a very important talk President Draghi gave in 2014 at Jackson Hole, if I recall it correctly. So Frank has been one of the most influential economists in terms of applied economics, but also in terms of research. Afterwards, Frank, if I've forgotten something, you should tell me. You have a PhD from Yale and you've published in all the top journals. What is, oh, come on. The second presenter is Daniel Gross, who's not yet in. Daniel is, for me, the Center for European Policy Studies, where he has been working since the mid-1980s, and the first study I read of Daniel was a two-handed approach on macroeconomics, and he has been highly influential with creating one of the most powerful think tanks in Europe, always contributing to debates across anything the European Union has been thinking of, and he's a prolific writer on all channels. So excellent to have him here. Ricardo has just left his chair. I don't know why. Ricardo is US educated. He was here at Harvard. He was at Yale, at Princeton. He's now professor of economics at LSE, and has been powerful in many domains. But also in practical terms, he's one of those economists who've been developing a synthetic fixed income instrument to deal with possible tensions arising from spread widening early on, about 12 years ago, with Markus Brunnermeier and others. So we are really privileged to have an excellent panel here. And by way of introducing, I'd like only to make 2 points, perhaps. First and foremost, the challenge is, of course, for the ECB, getting inflation down. this comes with additional challenges because we have a confluence of very difficult issues arising. Additional challenges could arise from the unprecedented dispersion of inflation rate across the euro area, going from 6% to 25%, mirroring to some degree difference in fiscal policy. But also balance sheet politics. The ECB is about to possibly reduce its balance sheet, could lead to spread widening, which would of course impede the singleness of monetary policy. So there's simply too much on the plate of central bankers now, and we are grateful to have three speakers who will speak to that. Frank, may I, two housekeeping remarks. For those of you who have questions, we would ask you to put them down in the Q&A. We will open the mic after the three presentations, and then we try to have as lively discussion as possible. Frank, may I ask you to come in?
Yes, thank you very much, both Claudio and Hans Helmut, for the invitation and for the two generous words. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. So let me find my presentation and share it with you. But before I start, let me also say that so I'm currently on leave from the ECB, so I have nothing to do with the current discussions in Frankfurt by the Governing Council, and anything I say is not related to that. I am actually currently a Hublot-Norman Fellow at the Bank of England, another interesting place to be as a macroeconomist. But needless to say, the usual disclaimer holds, so the views expressed are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of the ECB or the Bank of England for that matter. Now, what I want to do in my talk is basically, if I can move on, is basically sort of set the stage for our discussion in three parts. First, I want to talk or discuss what I think are some of the main drivers behind high inflation in the euro area. And then the main point will be that, I mean, what the euro area is facing is a massive terms of trade shock, a negative terms of trade shock, which leads to, makes the euro area economy poorer due to the energy crisis and the associated geopolitical tensions with Russia, and of course the war of Russia in Ukraine is part of that, as Hans Helmut mentioned. Then I want to go on in the second part to describe the ECB monetary policy response over basically this year, no, since January this year, and basically I will characterize it as monetary policy normalization from the very accommodative monetary policy stance that was a legacy from the response to the pandemic crisis. Once the lift-off conditions of the forward guidance were fulfilled, which were deemed to be fulfilled by the Governing Council in June. So, and it was not just, it's a front-loaded normalization, I should say, which I hope to show has led to a very significant tightening of real interest rates in the euro area towards levels that are close to what many people think is sort of R star, so the neutral real rate at this point in the euro area. And then third, I will ask the question, well, is the current policy stand, is that appropriate? No, given where inflation is, given where output is, given where interest rates are. That will be actually a relatively short session, and I will argue yes, on the basis of two main arguments. One is, if you look at inflation expectations, they are still broadly anchored at the relevant horizon, which is towards the end of the projection horizon, which is where ECB can influence interest rates. And secondly, I will argue that from a conceptual point of view, it is, at least in the basic New Keynesian framework, it is appropriate and optimal to keep interest rates at neutral when you're faced with a permanent supply shock, which is what the permanent terms of trade shock is in this case. So it is also a permanent supply shock. So basically that's the outline of the talk and kind of the main messages. Okay, so this is one way of characterizing what has happened this year. It's looking through the lens of the ECB macroeconomic projections for real GDP growth on the left-hand side and HICP inflation on the right-hand side. The blue lines are the projections in December last year. These were actually the last projections I was still responsible for. And so they showed that after sort of the recovery, ongoing recovery from the pandemic crisis, growth, which was very high, would sort of, with some bumps, slow down to potential growth towards the end of December 24. And inflation was seen as temporarily, headline inflation, which was around 4.5% at that time, was seen as temporarily and reverting back to 2% relatively quickly. Basically, by now, we should have seen 2% inflation, more or less. What happened, the red one is the September projections. So what happens, inflation, of course, continued to rise and is now, according to the September ECB projections, expected to take much longer to go back to 2%, but more or less converge back to 2% by the end of the projection horizon. Whereas, of course, growth is expected to slow down very significantly towards probably technical recessions in a number of euro area countries, if not for the euro area as a whole. These September projections are probably already a little bit on the optimistic side. So this is very much the picture of a negative supply shock. Inflation is being pushed up, growth is being pushed down. And so now, of course, underlying those projections is an implicit tightening of monetary policy as expected by markets. So whereas in the December projections, interest rates was still expected to be, very low, basically around zero, both short and long rates. In those most recent September projections, they have already been raised, but they're expected to sort of plateau around 2% in nominal terms. So, of course, again, the projections do incorporate this endogenous expected policy response. Now, what are the main sources? Now, on the left-hand side, you basically see decomposition in food, energy, and core inflation for the euro area, and on the right-hand side for the US. So 2/3 of the increase in inflation from 1% in January 2021 to close to 10% now is basically driven by energy price inflation and food price inflation. This is less the case in the US, although of course it's also an important factor, but their core inflation is somewhat more important. This is a huge shock for the euro area, and particularly it reflects, particularly the energy part, a terms of trade shock, because the euro area depends for 55% of its energy on imports from abroad, about 10% from Russia. And particularly, it's also very dependent on imports of gas, and particularly gas from Russia, which is shown in the right-hand side, and particularly in the Netherlands, Italy, and Germany, we're relying a lot on Russian gas, which of course now has mostly fallen away. So the big picture of this is that, or this is reflected in a sort of a massive deterioration of the energy trade balance, from like -1% in January to almost -5% in the most recent numbers, and a very strong terms of trade deterioration and sort of hit on real income in the euro area, of the order of 5%. So this is a big negative impact on income for the euro area. So it pushes up prices, but of course it reduces supply and demand. Now, there are some factors that may kind of offset some of this. One is fiscal policy, and of course that is part of the discussion. What is the appropriate fiscal response? And maybe Daniel will talk about that. I mean, these are some numbers taken from the ECB's Economic Bulletin, issue 5, an article on euro area fiscal policy response to the war in Ukraine and its macroeconomic effect. I mean, you see the effect on the right-hand side on real GDP growth, estimated effect according to the ECB of those energy compensatory measures and Ukraine-related spending. So it does offset a little bit the negative impact on real growth. So it's of the order of 0.5% according to those ECB estimates, and also the higher increase in inflation of about minus 0.767%. But not comparable, of course, to the impact of the initial shock. So there's a partial offset, but it's relatively small when you compare with the overall impact of the original shock. The other element that may sort of soften the blow a little bit is the fact that there have been a lot of accumulated savings during the pandemic. And so that you see here on the left-hand side. But so far, the impact of that has been actually relatively limited, partly because a lot of those savings are held by sort of the highest quintile, so the people who basically have very low marginal propensity to consume, and not those people who really need support now, which is the poorer households. And partly also because, of course, the war has also increased uncertainty, consumer uncertainty a lot, as you see on the right-hand side. So the big increase in February and March of this year. And consumer confidence has tanked. Precautionary saving has again increased and is reaching levels that we saw also during the pandemic. And so consumption is likely to be negatively affected by all of this. The other and final compensating factor is, of course, the labor market is still relatively strong. Actually, measured unemployment rate is at the lowest that it has been in the EMU period, or close to the lowest levels. So most of the job retention schemes have now gone away, and overall the labor market has largely returned to pre-pandemic levels. So that's definitely still a positive element in terms of softening a bit this blow. But we also know that the labor market is sort of typically a kind of a lagging market. So maybe there's more here to come. Now, so I emphasize the terms of trade shock, of course, and energy prices and food prices. But of course, I don't want to ignore that also core inflation, as Claudio mentioned, has been on the rise. And so on the left-hand side, you see that it is basically reaching 5%. And it's relatively broad-based across the different categories. And whatever indicator of underlying inflation you look at, you see that it is quite a lot above 2%. Now the question is, okay, where is this coming from? And here I'm just referring to some ECB work that was published in issue 7 of the Economic Bulletin this year, which tried to decompose, by looking at disaggregate sectors, the increase in non-energy good inflation and services inflation, which are the two components of core inflation, due to supply-driven shocks versus demand-driven shocks. And also here you see that a big part, particularly in non-energy industrial good, is supply-driven. A relatively smaller part is driven by demand. I mean, where does this come from? I mean, this is basically mostly a legacy from the pandemic, which has led to lots of sectoral reallocation from goods to services and back, or from services to goods and back, which has gone together with somewhat higher inflation, particularly in non-energy in goods inflation. Although, of course, lately some of these supply bottlenecks, as we call them, have kind of become better. So one indicator is suppliers' delivery times, which are normalizing, although they're not yet fully back to the pre-pandemic times. If you look at sort of the indicators that are really domestically generated inflation, and again, that's where we should look at, particularly at wages and in the labor market. I mean, you see that not much has happened yet, at least in the statistics. So the middle graph basically gives you in the red line negotiated wage inflation. I mean, the latest number is 2.8%, which is not something, it's completely compatible with a 2% inflation target. And of course, much lower than what we see in the US on the left-hand side, where it's above 6%. The right-hand side gives you another sort of interesting indicator, which is the component of the core inflation that we deem to be wage sensitive. So sectors that where there's a lot of labor share is large, labor input. You see it has been picking up. It's 2.5%, so it's above 2%, but it's still quite low. So, I mean, the bottom line from this sort of very quick run through some of the inflation data is that the most important driver is this terms of trade shock and some of the sort of propagation of that shock through the production network in the euro area, plus some legacy from the pandemic misallocation and relatively little contribution from domestically generated wage inflation or domestic generated service inflation, although the labor market is quite tight. So let me then talk about ECB monetary policy response. I mean, this is basically summarizes what the ECB has been doing this year. It basically followed very much the forward guidance it had given and the sequencing of the normalization that it had announced. So in December 2021, when headline inflation was close to 5% and core inflation was sort of slightly above 2%, it announced the end of the pandemic emergency purchase program, which was then ended in the first quarter of this year. Then in July, it announced the end of the APP net purchases. Again, that was in line with the sequences that it would first stop net purchases shortly before lifting of the interest rate. And that's indeed what then happened. The first increase in policy rates was in July 2022 by 50 basis points. At the same time, there was the introduction of the transition protection instrument. And then last September, it was a second rate increase by 75 basis points. And I guess tomorrow we'll have another increase, according to the markets, most likely another 75 basis points. So the way ECB has described this, I think itself, is that this is like a front-loaded transition from the initially high accommodative level of policy rates towards levels that will ensure a timely return of inflation to 2%. Based on the current assessment, the Governing Council expects to raise interest rates further. And it sort of course, transitioned from not a forward guidance approach to a data-dependent and meeting by meeting approach. Now, what has been the implications for financial conditions? On the left-hand side here, you see the forward curve for the policy rate, the S there. So this is 10 October, so it's not completely up to date, but it's more or less, I think, also in the current ballpark. Markets now expect, or these forward rates are around 3%, so a bit higher than what was in the September forecast. Although if you make a correction for forward premium, which is the little triangles there, it's a bit less. So then it would suggest the terminal rate at that time was expected to be around 2.5%. When you look at the 10-year sovereign spreads, I mean, not much has happened. I mean, they're very volatile over the year, but more or less, with the exception of Italy, they have been fluctuating around a sort of a constant level. Of course, bond yields have increased tremendously, from basically 0% to 3%. That's true for 300 basis points over this year. That's true both for the 10-year GDP-weighted sovereign yield and the 10-year nominal OIS. And on the right-hand side, you see that this is now quite quickly translating into lending rates, bank lending rates for firms and households. Now, sometimes it's claimed that this is not really a tightening because inflation has increased by 10 percentage points. Nominal yields have increased by 3 percentage points. So the real rates have still fallen, but that's comparing apples with pears. Of course, you look at the same horizon. And that's what we're doing here in this graph. So actually focus on the right-hand panel, which shows euro area real rates, in basically the OIS and inflation linked swap markets. You see that during the pandemic crisis, till the Russian crisis, the expansionary monetary policy actually led to this gradual decline in real rates at all horizons. The green one is the 5-year real rate. The red one is the 10-year spot real rate. And the blue one is the 5-year forward 5-year rate. So all of them have fallen. But since then, since basically January this year, when the tightening cycle started, the real rate, so if you take, for example, the 5-year real rate, has increased by more than 200 basis points. So the tightening that we've seen is a real tightening. And of course, the mirror image of that is that inflation expectations as such, and particularly the longer term inflation expectations, have stabilized since the beginning of this year. So that was the second part, which basically was to say the ECB has once the lift-off conditions for its forward guidance were satisfied, which was they deemed to be satisfied in June, they had a front-loaded normalization of monetary policy, which is expected to end up around the neutral rate, which is now between 2% and 3%, I would argue. Now then, okay, let's go to the last question. If I still have a few minutes, is this current policy stance appropriate? And of course, we can discuss this for weeks and months, and different views all have surely their merit. But how can we assess? Now, the main, of course, way to assess it using data is just by looking at whether financial markets, market analysts, households, firms still think the ECB has inflation under control, whether this projection of the ECB that inflation will come down to 2% by the end of our projection horizon under the current policy stance, whether that's credible. So this set of graphs is basically to show you that, broadly speaking, that is the case. So on the left-hand side, if you look again at those inflation-linked swap markets, which allow you to have relatively clean measures of expected inflation in financial markets, and you see that financial markets still expect these inflation rates to come down to 2% relatively quickly by in 2024. So at the end of the projection horizon, and then stay there. If you look at analysts in the middle graph, you go from blue to orange to red. You basically go from the current expectations of inflation by analysts, the mean expectation for 2022, 2023, and 2024. So of course, for 2022, expectation is that it's high, 8%. For next year, it's much lower, it's about half, 4.5%. For 2024, it's very close to 2%. I mean, the only expectations where we see some kind of disanchoring or some lifting off in terms of the mean, or the median, I should say, is with the household expectations, where we now have at ECB a very useful consumer expectations survey, which also tracks inflation expectations. And there you see, again, you see the same phenomenon, no? That when you go from actual inflation to 1 year ahead to 3 year ahead inflation, it comes down. But at least for the mean, it doesn't come down now fully to 2% anymore. So there is a little bit of a risk of a disanchoring of household inflation expectations when you believe those numbers. Now, these are means or medians. Obviously, we know there's huge uncertainty around this. I mean, you see that in the volatility of inflation markets, but you also see it now in the cross-sectional distribution. And there is just one sort of picture on the right-hand side to show that particularly there is a group of people amongst professional forecasters, a growing group of people that think inflation in 5 years' time may actually be higher than 2.5%. The median is still very firmly at 2%, but there is this tail event, and of course, Ricardo has worked on some of those distributions and their forecasting problems. So clearly indicating there are some risks that obviously the ECB needs to monitor. But broadly speaking, I would say the ECB's policy is still credible. Let me just end with one sentence about the kind of the conceptual argument that I wanted to make. If you are faced, if a central bank is faced with a permanent supply shock, so the potential output permanently is lower, and the kind of the price level, if you like, permanently higher, in a new Keynesian framework where you start from a neutral rate and you start from anchored inflation expectation, the optimal policy is to stick with neutral. And so one interpretation, again, if you think about the conceptual benchmark of what ECB is doing, I'm not saying that's their conceptual benchmark, it's my conceptual benchmark. One way of interpreting what ECB is doing is exactly that. Given that they started from a very sort of easy accommodate, non-neutral accommodation, they are trying to move relatively quickly to neutral, and then see how this permanent negative supply shock is phasing out, where there's some positive impacts on inflation, which are on the price level, which are supposed to over time to move out of the inflation numbers, and there is a negative permanent level effect on output. So let me stop here. I mean, these were basically my main kind of messages that I mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. You promised to set the stage, what you did marvelously. First, giving us a background about the drivers of inflation, and in highlighting the very significant negative terms of trade shock, -5%, which is something like double the oil price shock, by the way, of the early 1980s. Then you explained that the ECB was sticking with its forward guidance, and basically in line with the scenario it had given to markets. And finally, you argued that the stance of monetary policy, in your view, is appropriate in light of the possibly fading away of this price level shock. I now will hand over to Daniel. Daniel hasn't been in when I was lauding him dramatically, so he missed out on very positive remarks on you, Daniel. May I ask you to come in? You're muted.
And now I'm no longer muted. Can you hear me now? You should hear me now.
Yes, yes, you can share your screen.
Okay, good. Thank you. I wanted just to concentrate on one part, which is also more central to Frank's presentation, namely the gas price question. And the gas price question is particular to Europe because the oil price is, as we know, a global price. Oil is very easily tradable, but gas has a specificity that it was mainly arriving in Europe via pipelines. And one part of that gas is no longer arriving, meaning that on the world market now gas is missing. And the only way Europe can now come through, get through the winter would be by a combination of two things. There have to be savings within Europe and an additional supply of gas, which can only arrive via LNG. And given that most exporters are already at the limit with their production capacity, we can only have more LNG arriving in Europe when we basically buy out other people who would otherwise have consumed the same LNG that we now want to have. That means the global price of LNG has to increase so that consumers elsewhere could use less gas. And I wanted to point out two particular aspects of this situation. And let me try now to share. I can. You should see now a chart with gas prices. And I show you here three gas prices. The blue line is the famous TTF, which is the European spot price. The orange line is the JKM, the Japan-Korea marker. So basically the Asian price. And the green one is the Henry Hub, which is the price in the United States. Now, first United States, you see that that price remains much lower, by an order of magnitude lower, 4 times lower than in Europe. And that is because although there is plenty for production of gas in the US, very little of it can get out because the export capacity is being used to a max. But what you also see is that the orange line and the blue line are moving very closely together. And that is because of this market integration, which I mentioned earlier. LNG is one global market, and if in Europe is more demanded, then the price has to go up on both sides of the Eurasian landmass in both Europe and Asia. You see that over the summer in Europe, we had a premium, a strong premium also at time over Japan, but this has now fallen. Actually, the very last observation is one where Europe and Asia are again equal. So this has one important implication. It means also in terms of competitiveness for our industries, they are facing basically the same marginal price of gas as the Asians. And that means this the negative impact of this high price of gas will hit industries in Japan, in Korea and Asia, and in Europe as well, meaning there's no loss of competitiveness. And therefore, governments should really think twice before they engage in vast programs to support industry. I mentioned just en passant something else, which is a strange phenomenon for which I haven't found a good explanation, but which is also part of the terms of trade laws. Here in this graph, you see again the blue line, which is the TTF. And then you see the orange line, which is much, let's say, more steady. And that is the price of coal, Newcastle coal. And the strange result that you find is that the price of coal has increased in proportional terms as much as the price of gas. Now, for the price of gas, at the political level, very often is argued that's a price which is influenced by financial market consideration, the speculation, and so on. That's not the price of coal. Now, one reason it could be, of course, is that in Europe and elsewhere, people are substituting coal for gas in the production of electricity. And that would motivate this increase, but it's still strange that the elasticity of supply for coal is not high enough to prevent this extraordinarily high price increase. Again, it's 4 times higher than in the past. The past is not just 2020, but the average of the years 2017 to 2020. So this is, I think, something we have to keep in mind when we're looking at the energy equation for Europe. But let me come to the main point I wanted to make in terms of policy. And that is the simple fact that we are facing now in Europe a very inelastic supply of gas. Because, as I mentioned earlier, it's not a question of increasing production somewhere, but to buy out other people. And we know that the demand for gas is very inelastic. The typical estimates are 0.1 tenth. Now, what does it imply for the marginal cost of gas for Europe? This is not just the price, but it is the change in the import bill when the quantity imported goes up. And a very standard equation, which I show here, shows that the marginal cost of gas is then the price times 1 plus the inverse of the supply elasticity. And as I showed earlier, the supply elasticity is 1/10. So the real cost of gas for Europe is much, much higher than the price that we see either the TTF or anything else. And this is something which policymakers have not really internalized. It has one important implication. We really need governments to subsidize gas savings, because every cubic meter saved in Europe reduces our import bill, not by the price of gas that we see, but by the price of gas times this multiplier, which could be as large as 11. And that means that anything which encourages the use of gas in Europe, consumption of gas, for example, for electricity purposes in Spain, or any price reduction, would be counterproductive, because most of the money that we would then pay to those people who are subsidized would result in higher prices of imports, and the money would indirectly go directly, or rather indirectly, to our foreign suppliers. And this is, if you want, my main point I can conclude here. That is the main point that we should keep in mind when thinking about how to deal with the gas question in Europe at this point in time. And of course, any consumption saving in Europe will also make the task for the ECB easier, because it would mean lower gas prices. So reducing in terms of trade loss and reducing the pressure also, as we know, not only on gas, but also on electricity prices, because electricity is priced after gas. So the quantity we are consuming is really a key variable that we should aim at, and not so much how we can help people paying for the gas that they need. And this is my plea, so to speak, that this should be the core element of European energy policy at this point in time, how to subsidize consumption. And I would say that even if you pay people the current market price for every cubic meter of gas they consume less, that would be might have a high fiscal cost, but it would save Europe an enormous amount of money because the import bill would go down. That is my simple message. I hope I have convinced you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. That was a very powerful message, insisting on the specificity of the gas market and its very low elasticity of supply, and taking account of the also very low elasticity of consumption, and ultimately of where subsidies will end up. So that was a very powerful argument, and you've written about that over the last couple of months very convincingly. I now hand over to Ricardo Reich. And without further ado, Ricardo.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Let me just share my screen. And sorry, 1 second. View full screen. So can you confirm just so you can see it? Yeah?
You do.
Okay, terrific. Well, thank you very much for having me here. What I want to present is basically an answer to this question here. What can keep euro area inflation high? I don't want to give you the context, add some pictures on how inflation has risen, but Frank has already pretty much done it. And so let me go straight to the question I want to ask. Like Frank put it, I think the question at this point is less what inflation is going to be in the next 12 months, shocks as well. So on the one hand, who knows what exact shocks we'll have on the energy components of inflation. On the other hand, because monetary policy to some regards can do very little about the next 6 to 12 months given the lags in policy. A more interesting question is looking 24 months ahead from now, so the end of 2024, beginning of 2025, is inflation going to be back at 2%? And as Frank showed you, if you look at market expectations embedded in prices, in asset prices, I'm sorry, roughly there seems to be a case that for the most part, it is expected that the ECB will achieve this, although with somewhat uncomfortable, let's say, tail risks, or if you want, probably they may not. That's not as close to zero as one might want. I want to approach this question from a very, in a sense, in a way that is the one that gives a bad reputation to economists, which is to think, what could go wrong? I'm not going to forecast when the ECB is going to do it. I'm going to focus precisely, if you want, on the tail risks and think about what could prevent a central bank, which has a very clear Maastricht mandate of price stability, in 2 years, fail to achieve it. Why do I frame the question this way? Because one, can it do so? Sure. Ultimately, lowering inflation is not something mysterious. You hike policy rates quickly and persistently enough, and inflation will come down. Maybe not as fast as you would want, but it will come down. I think I see very little in the evidence of the last 2 years that contradicts this basic dictum of monetary policy. That it should do so is also very clear. Interpret it, we can disagree on what does it mean to deliver price stability in the medium term. Maybe my 2 years isn't quite enough. Maybe you want to say, no, you should really look at 2.5 or 3 years, but give me that. I think that 2% should be there somewhere in 2025, if not even by the end of 2024, I think is unquestionable. So the question is, if it can do so, and it should do so, when one asks, will it fail to do so? What are the circumstances under which it may fail to do so? Ultimately, I think the right answer is to use a term that economists have used for a long time, and which in this presentation, in this paper, I want to extend a little bit. And that is to say, it will fail to do so if it gets dominated. So dominate is the word that I will say. That is, why? Because starting from high inflation, when would an interest rate central bank fail to achieve the target? Well, ultimately, we're asking if it will. When will it fail to hike the policy rates quickly and persistently enough in order to do so? Given that its mandate is to deliver inflation, it must be because If it failed to do so, it is because it was dominated by some other factor or some other agent. And that's what I'm going to spend the next 25 to 30 minutes talking about. First, let's start with the evolution of the real economy. Let me start with some relatively elementary theory. The nominal interest rate, and noticeably the policy rate, but since I'm thinking here over the next 2 years, think about this as the average policy rate over the next 2 years, will equal the private real rate of return in the economy. Oops, sorry for the misspelling. Private real rate of return in the economy, plus the expected inflation over this 2 to 3 year horizon. Okay. From this Fisher equation relation follows that the central bank to deliver over this medium-term horizon an inflation that is on average on target, well, over this 2 year horizon, insofar as expectations are going to be broadly in line with the target, insofar, and I will talk more about that, then it follows that you want to have a nominal interest rate that tracks a neutral rate, defined roughly as the private real rate of return plus that inflation target of 2%. So far, so good, with the difficulty being in practice, and the reason why we have to employ a few hundred people in Frankfurt, that measuring the private real rate of return is not easy. This is not an observed concept, but must be estimated. One can summarize in a simplistic way that all of the work of the central bank staff is to figure out what is the state of the economy, where the state of the economy in this very simple theory is captured by what is this private real rate of return. It therefore also follows that inflation will be high if you underestimate that neutral rate. If you keep policy rates too low for too long, then in doing so, inflation will be above target. So the simplest form of domination is that the central bank is, I'm going to call it, dominated by misjudgment, for lack of a better word, when it clings to wide and outdated theory or the outdated measurement of the economy, finding always excuses for why inflation is rising that absolve it from responsibility. The agent dominating the policymaker here, if you want, is the staff, is the ECB staff in our application, or the policymaker's judgment, because they repeatedly are underestimating the neutral rate of interest and therefore setting too low rates. So, having defined this first form of misjudgment, how could it lead to a misjudgment in the ECB over the next 2 years? The first application would be if we persistently underestimate how high we'll have to raise rates. And here, remembering the 1970s, such a formative moment for central banks, is important, where we had a combination of very imperfect real-time data, energy shocks, and transitorily elevated expectations, all leading to great difficulties of measurement that, as we look back now, made it seem as if policymakers were always setting throughout most of the decade, certainly in the United States and in many Western countries, though not all, setting interest rates below the natural rate. And here is a simple calculation that also provides a nice match to some of Frank's discussion. If you think that in the long run, so now we're not talking over the next 2 years, but over the next 10 years, the ECB has an inflation target of 2%, and the real private rate of return in the economy is around 1%. Some people will argue it's a little bit less. Some people will argue it's a little bit more. 2 plus 1 is 3. That means that the neutral rate, which is not the same as the long run rate, the long run rate is a neutral rate over the next 5 successive 2-year periods. It says that the interest rate has to rise to around 3%, precisely the number that Frank showed that the ECB is going towards. And where, again, he said, well, maybe 3, maybe 2.5, that would have to map necessarily, I guess Frank can reply in the discussion, to thinking that the real interest rate is around 0.5, or in order to justify a 3 or 2.5. Note, though, that in order to keep inflation on target, you have to deliver at least this, because, and this is important, remember that we're starting from inflation well above target. Therefore, you need to be at least at 3%. Again, we can argue if that number should be 2.5 or 3.5. I think you can really make an easy case for 3.5 or 4. It's all about really discussing here what our start is, the long run value of the neutral rate in terms of that point. So what would be the misjudgment dominance here is believing that you can raise rates and stop them, I think, at something like 2%, as is implicit in some of the judgments now. Second, there is a conceptual form of this misjudgment dominance, which relies precisely on saying, no, I only need to go to 2% because I think the R star, again, the long run average of neutral rates over the next 5 2-year periods, is not 1%, but is rather 0% or even lower. The difficulty with that is that to argue that today R star over the next 10 years is that low relies on very much looking at the rate of return on government bonds, what I have here in black on average for the G7. And this is, by the way, the nominal rate. So if you subtract -2, you'd end up with roughly a 0%, relying essentially on this black line as being a perfect estimate of R star. However, if one looks at most rates of return in the economy, and note that here, this was not the rate of return on government bonds, but the rate of return on the economy. The black line measures the return on government bonds, but the other R star, the R star on the private real rate of the economy, has actually over the last 10 years barely changed. And if anything, it would be in terms of levels, more like you start from 8, subtract 2, but then you also have to subtract an equity risk, or not equity risk, a risk premium in general of the private economy. So you end up with numbers closer to 1 or 2%, as I was writing here above. Now, to put all eggs on the black line, and therefore say all we need is to raise 2%, I would argue is potentially a very risky thing to do when looking at these two R stars. And by the way, there's many more R stars in between, depending on which asset you look at, exactly how do you measure private returns in the economy. I worry that putting all the eggs on the black line means using government bonds as the right true measure of the returns on the private economy, when in fact, over the last 20 years, we've had multiple pieces of research arguing, noting, demonstrating that government bonds over this period were very special. They provided what sometimes are just convenience yields, where that's nothing but saying that they are a bad representation of R star. That's what the convenience says. There's something pushing them down below what R star should be. So conceptually relying too much on the black line, government bond returns, the R star, would lead you to think that this should be a 0 and therefore end up at 2% instead of 3%. Those are the two forms of judgment, which may be there or may not be, but it is important to keep those into account. Second set of factors, expectation and credibility. As always, let me introduce a little bit of theory. Central bankers over the last 20 years, and the ECB in particular, has rightfully earned what I had called in previous work a capital of inattention, by which I mean a large part of expectations, either by some agents or partially by all agents, believe that inflation will be 2% in 2024, no matter what. That is great, and that is how it should be. At the same time, even if that share was 100% 2 years ago, it is likely at least not 100% today. There's just fewer today. There's at least some people that are doubting the ECB may deliver. Second, there's also a share of agents who economists back in the 1970s and 80s, or still Keynesian economists today, think are 100% of all people, which is that people that are entirely backward looking, which believe that whatever inflation was in the last 12 months is what inflation is going to be over the next 24 months. Those people, I think we've grown in economic theory to think that these people are not 100%, if anything closer to 0%, but they're certainly probably more than 0% today. There are some households and very good theories justifying that look at inflation today and extrapolate into the future. And so there's going to be more of these agents today. If this is a capital of attention, this is a measure of lost credibility. When agents are saying, I will not trust what you say, what Maastricht says, what your mandate says, I'm just going to look at the numbers in the last 12 months and believe that that's where we're going to be in 24 months. Finally, there's a final group that have their expectations affected by policy speeches and by the actual policy setting. You can simplify this in a tree horizon by having rational expectations, but you can deviate from the rationality as long as these agents, unlike the previous two, are agents where whatever the ECB does affects what they expect. Here, these guys, it doesn't matter what the ECB does, they believe 2% no matter what. These guys, it doesn't matter what the ECB does. Inflation was high in the last 12 months, I think it's going to be high in the next 12 months. What that means is that monetary policy has now two functions when it tries to bring down high inflation. The first one is act tough, raise rates more than neutral rates, above neutral rates, potentially a lot above neutral rates. Why? Knowing that you cannot affect these ones, the fact that some guys are going to expect high inflation no matter what, that high expected inflation shows up just like a supply shock in terms of the data that Frank showed, but instead that shift in the Phillips curve is coming because of the backward-looking expectations. And the only way to bring it down is to raise interest rates very aggressive. Why? By leveraging this final group and the consequence on the demand side of the group to bring down inflation. Second, talking tough. Talking tough is nothing but trying to leverage instead the first group. That is, talking in speeches and others tough enough to convince you to stop paying attention to the ECB, to go back to your lives, expect inflation to be 2% in 2025. You don't need to keep on monitoring it, and regain international capital has been regained. When is the central bank then dominated by expectations? It is dominated by expectations when this group is prevalent, expected inflation is persistently high, and the central bank does not act tough or talk tough enough in order to establish credibility reputation. Who's dominating here? Wage setters, price setters, market participants, through what Keynes would have called their animal spirits, and which maybe we want to say a lack of trust in the central bank, that is an erosion of its capital of inattention and some lost credibility, as I said there. What are the fears here that could dominate the ECB over the next 2 years? I shouldn't have said today, but over the next 2 years. One, that it fears being unpopular by talking tough on inflation all the time and never talking about unemployment. It's certainly the case that central bankers, up until just 6 months ago in Europe and elsewhere, were very fearful of talking tough on inflation, and we're very focused on talking tough on unemployment. And we already see, if you open any newspaper today, to see them being criticized, being unpopular for saying that they worried so much about inflation. If they become afraid of this and they don't act tough, they don't regain this capital of inattention, then we will have the expected inflation showing up and driving inflation up. Second, and here let me give a counter to what something Frank said, which is and Frank's diagnosis of what the ECB is doing, but not just diagnosis, but Frank's correct conceptual point that is the right thing to do in his very last observation. Frank noted, if all we have is a supply shock, or in terms of trade shock, then converging to the neutral rate from below can be optimal. It's not always optimal, but can be optimal, okay? That is conditional on expectations of inflation being completely anchored, and Frank was very clear about, or was very coherent in his presentation, because he showed you several slides saying, I think expectations are anchored, so what he said was completely coherent. That is, if you think that looking 2 years ahead, essentially, we're still at 0% agents here, that is, there's no persistence of inflation. Either no one's paying attention, we believe 2%, or we're going to have 2% because we believe 2%. Although you really need to go to capital inattention because we're going to have some inflation above 2% in 2 years. But note, what if we have that some agents believe that high inflation is persisting, some wage setters, price setters, market setters are having animal spirits and think that inflation is going to be a little higher. In that case, the 1970s offer the key lesson that was later encapsulated in theory by John Taylor. If you're trying to converge the neutral rate from below, as Frank described ECB is potentially trying to do, and justify itself as doing coherently by Frank's account, the problem you face is that you will have, if you happens to have some of this credibility expectations dominance, you will have inflation getting out of hand, out of hand, out of hand, out of hand. The right thing to do is instead, as the Burns-Volcker experience shows, to actually raise rates well above the neutral rate, overshoot if you want, and then, by the way, lower them very quickly. People forget how quickly Volcker bring them down. Why? Because the idea of hiking rates so above the natural rate, and boy, did Volcker go well above the natural rate, is precisely to regain the credibility, to act tough, to leverage the final group, and in doing so, be able to bring inflation back on target. If you think that there's some expectations dominance, gradualism is wrong, overshooting is absolutely right. And I hope it was clear here how this complements Frank's observation and analysis and why he may be right or he may be wrong, but this is the other possible case out there. Number 3, fiscal policy and debt crisis. Again, a little bit of theory. What can the central bank do about it, and how can it be fiscally dominated? Theory is simply the government budget constraint saying that how much debt you repay, you can either repay debt by the primary balance, by debt revenue, by which I mean selling government bonds at a higher price than is the equivalent price for a private asset, and therefore pocketing the difference, or by the value of future debt. Now, when you have a fall in government prices or an increase in yields, the dramatic impact that has on the government budget constraint is that it lowers debt revenue. That revenue, again, comes from the difference, the sometimes called a seigniorage revenue for issuing debt, although I find that incorrect because seigniorage really refers to banknotes, comes from being able to sell overpriced bonds, because bonds, as I had mentioned 5 minutes ago, are seen as special. They provide some service and people are willing to pay very large prices for them. Okay. If bond prices fall, this will lower the debt revenue. Now, calculations of research of the last 24 months have suggested that as much as the debt revenue, present value of debt revenue, has been as much as 100% of GDP for many countries in the Eurozone. And that's explained why is it that we've had debt to GDPs of 100%, even though the present value of primary balances for the majority of countries in the Eurozone is pretty close to zero, or is maybe around 10, 15%, given the forecasted surpluses are tiny. If there's a fall in bond prices, the lowering of that revenue causes either the need to raise those primary balances or a default, both of which put pressure over the fiscal policy. How can monetary policy help, if you want? It can help because if it lowers policy rates, we know that lowering policy rates has a positive impact on bond prices. Now, if this lowering, it's not a one-to-one impact because the relevant bond price is here for the average maturity of the bond, whereas the other policy we're talking over a 2-year horizon, because there's term premium, there's risk premium and others, but still the relation tends to be such that lower policy rates increase bond prices. And second, the central bank can buy the bonds, because in buying the bonds, it means that there's less bonds out there for the private sector to hold. They continue to be scarce, their specialness is preserved, and therefore the premium they're earning, the debt revenue is still high. A central bank is then fiscally dominated when it, because of this term, when it does not, again, hike rates enough, does not bring inflation control, because it fears the impact this has on debt revenues and in breaking the government's budget. It is a fiscal authority here that's dominating, if you want, forcing the central bank not to harm its fiscal position. Could this happen in the ECB over the next 2 years? Understanding again that debt revenue, here's just a simple expression of debt revenue, the gross revenue on debt in the G7 in red, in blue, the interest payments on that, the difference between them is the net revenue, and here are the primary balances. Just to make the point that I already made in words, which is it's this gap that is essentially paid for all of the deficits of the last 20 years, even as we were running all of those deficits and debt was increasing. The dominance is, again, that the ECB delays hiking rates because it is afraid of shrinking that debt revenue. It is afraid that the fall in the government bond prices increases that blue line towards the red line and closes that. However, it is important here to keep in mind that in the long term, even though the ECB, by keeping interest rates too low for too long, could increase that revenue, note that insofar as this generates inflation and risk of inflation, that makes the debt less safe. Being less safe, it is a less useful as collateral. It is a less appealing store of value for foreigners and others that want to hold it. In other words, the government debt becomes less special, and in being less special, will close that gap in the first place. So this is a clear case of a short-term benefit that comes with a long-term loss. Second, and related, the ECB can say, no, I want to keep on raising policy rates, but I will buy the bonds to keep them scarce. That is to have expansionary balance sheet, even as one is raising rates. One can look, for instance, at in a very micro level, what happened at the Bank of England over the last month to see an example of this happening. Problem with that is that as the Bank of England, as the ECB would be expanding its balance sheet, in the case of the ECB would be through a triggering of the tip mechanism, well, it is sustaining that revenue of the government. The debt revenue of the government is nothing but a transfer from the bondholder, the creditor, to the central bank by buying these overvalued bonds. Well, if the person buying is the ECB, then what you have is essentially the ECB, the benefits, the gains of the authority are nothing but, sooner or later, losses for the central bank. And we're already seeing how then an accumulation of loss of the central bank could themselves ultimately bring the credibility of the euro and thus inflation to account. And finally, thirdly, but I'll mention this very slowly since these are more political issues in the good sense of the term and have been discussed also this morning, which is the extent to which DCB can be fiscally dominant because it tries to use its balance sheet to transfer across regions. There are several of these theories across different regions, and in doing so, it can undermine the legality of the euro. But let me just leave it at that. Fourth, financial dominance. Again, some theory. Higher policy rates will raise lending rates, but we know from theory that this happens less than 1-to-1. Why? Because there's market power of lenders in a simple summary statement. Higher rates also raise deposit rates, but less than 1-to-1, because again of market power on the part of banks. Oh, this was a typo. More than 1-to-1 because of market power, not less than 1-to-1, but less than 1-to-1 because of market power. In other words, that intermediation margins tend to increase with policy rates. That means that change in policy rates affect markups and come with very large redistributions. Against this, we have that the central bank also has two tools beyond those changes in policy rates. Looser macroprudential policy lowers intermediation costs, although that looser macroprudential policy usually comes with less demands that banks hold government bonds. Some of those demands is what generates debt revenue in the first place, and so can itself trigger a fiscal dominance. And second, liquidity policy expansion of the balance sheet in order to lower the scarcity of deposits, although again, this can lead to the fiscal dominance through the loss of the central bank. But either way, the central bank is financially dominated when it resists bringing inflation down, it resists hiking rates, because it fears the impact this has on the relative market power of deposit and credit institutions, and in doing so, breaking parts of the financial system. It is now the financial sector that dominates the central bank, forcing it to not risk a financial crisis. How should this show up at ECB? In three ways, potentially in the next 2 years. First, and more notably, inflation comes with very large redistributions. Increasing in policy rates comes with very large distributions between creditors and debtors and different agents. Higher rates raise intermediation margins and especially lead to very large distribution in credit and in housing markets. Therefore, there will always be financial groups, and you just have to open the FT to see them speaking very loudly, arguing for why policy rates hikes should be delayed in order to favor one group in the financial sector instead of others. When you have high inflation and high interest rates, there are going to be winners and losers, and you will have someone on that side. Also note, by the way, that these change in intermediation margins precisely that make the R star even harder to measure and make it more likely the misjudgment as different returns fluctuate between that green and that black line. Second, central banks may be unwilling to loosen macroprudential policy and to engage in aggressive liquidity policies to handle the financial stress. Macroprudential, there's a tendency in times of stress, and certainly the tendency in the last 10 years is that we never relax macroprudential policy. But if you are putting stress in the financial system because of the hike in rates, loosening macroprudential policy may well be the right way to be able to bring down inflation without breaking the financial system. Likewise, and I'll appeal again to the Bank of England last month, maybe raising rates while at the same time providing liquidity to markets and expanding the balance sheet is indeed the way to preserve the ability to raise rates and control inflation. After all, just talking about macroprudential policy, the whole idea fundamentally of having macroprudential policy is to be able to release monetary policy from financial considerations so that monetary policy can focus on controlling inflation. At the same time, as I said, they can make a vehicle for fiscal dominance. The third one, though, is, if you want, though, the more tragic one of financial dominance. An increase in interest rates leads to a fall in the price of government bonds, as I noted, and leads to potential losses to banks. That means that higher policy rates, through, say, the increase in sovereign debt risk, lead to losses on the banks, make it more likely that banks fail, need to be bailed out, justifying the sovereign debt risk, and also likewise mean that there's less credit and an increase in the sovereign debt risk. All of you, certainly on my screen and probably attending this conference, have heard of this. This is the very famous diabolic loop, doom loop, and other. That was a very big part of what happened in 2011 and 12. Since then, we have pretty much, I think, diagnosed how to break this loop and avoid a new financial crisis in Europe. It is a combination of a triangle of some form of deposit insurance, so that each bank isn't completely tied to its sovereign, some sense of risk-weighted sovereign holdings, so that each bank does not overload on bonds of its country, and some safe asset to then replace those national bonds, some euro-wide safe asset to replace those national bonds by others. Now, over the last 10 years, we spent a lot of time debating how big should this triangle be. The smaller version is one that has in the safe assets some sovereign bond backed SB type securities, that has a deposit insurance only looking forward, that has only concentration limits and nothing else on sovereign bonds in the banks. A wider triangle has deposit insurance towards everything, Euro bonds, and a true risk weighting of sovereign holdings. We haven't been able to agree on that, sadly. We have not therefore solved the diabolic loop problem. The fear that what would be truly tragic is if now the ECB would not raise interest rates, would let inflation go out of control because it fears the diabolic loop breaking us just like it in 2011 or 12. Fifth and final one, and I want to finish with real activity. Well, you'll see why. First, when the real rate of return theory, when the rate of return is high relative to our star, there is an output gap, and that output gap puts upward pressure on inflation as the economy is running hot, the Phillips curve. All the previous results that I've said hold, but now you have the issue that if there are shocks, much like Frank was emphasizing, from energy markets, from deglobalization, from sectoral adjustment, they will show up as market shocks, which implies that bringing down inflation too quickly may come with a negative output gap. A trade-off emerged. Let me define a central bank as being dominated by the fear of a recession if it persistently raises the policy rates too little or too late, that's a lot of typos, sorry, because it is concerned with the resulting depth of the recession. The agents behind this dominance are usually politicians who are naturally representing the people afraid of a recession. Why do I want to finish with this form of dominance? Because I want to make clear, if it wasn't clear already in these 20 minutes, that it is okay to be dominated sometimes. If indeed by raising rates and being inflation much too quickly, you are going to break the economy, break the financial sector, break the budget in a way that would lead to much larger losses than the benefits of bringing inflation, that's okay. Having said that, I'm looking at a 24-month horizon, and the Maastricht Treaty is clear. The central bank, the ECB, should not be dominated by recession fears, financial fears, fiscal fears, misjudgment fears, or others, but should be delivering on inflation. Moreover, how can this, however, still play an important role? It can play an important role if policymakers think that the Phillips curve is flat, and as a result, that you can achieve some benefits in terms of preventing a recession by keeping policy rates low, again, over the next 24 months. The form of dominance here comes because if record high inflation persists because of that timidity, wages and prices are likely to start adjusting much faster. We're seeing that in the US, as Frank showed in the last 6 months. I would venture the same will happen in 6 months in Europe if inflation doesn't come down quickly. And then you have that the Phillips curve becomes, instead of steep, very flat. Instead of flat, very steep, because as inflation persists, it is the slope of the Phillips curve that shifts in a very dramatic way and means that by seeking recession dominance, the central bank lets inflation get out of control. The second one is an interpretation of the state of the economy. In this time of great uncertainty with the shocks, it is dangerous to potentially overestimate potential output. And this is something that's been with monetary theorists for many decades. It is tempting to see all shocks as being completely just external shocks that left the productive capacity of the economy unchanged, and recession dominance emerges if the central bank refuses to accept that a recession next year in Europe is inevitable, and maybe even over the next 2 years, given the size of the supply shock. Let me conclude. And that's why I wanted to end with the recession fears. Economic policy always requires a balancing act. Dominance makes it sound like there's a 0-1, you either dominate it or not. Hopefully, by going through these trade-offs, at least for one of them, and I think I went through 12 or 13, for some you said, that's okay. I wouldn't mind being dominated in that sense a little bit. For instance, because you think that causing a financial crash it would be a pretty bad idea. So it is always the case that economic policy requires a balancing act, and you should not think of dominance as being of a central bank that's completely non-dominated by anything else. At the same time, when one looks at a 24-month horizon and one asks the very gloomy precautionary perspective that I took in these 20 minutes, which is, let me just imagine what could go wrong. And what could go wrong is that these dominants become not just something that should always be a little present, but becomes truly dominant in the sense of preponderant, in the sense of being a major consideration leading to deviation from inflation falling. I took a very, if you want, monetarist approach, this is the ECB can deliver, and ask, when will ECB fail to deliver because it finds itself dominated? These are my forms of dominance, which I call misjudgment, expectations, fiscal, financial, or dominated by recession fears. And here they are for you to judge whether for each one of these you think, I think I'm going to guess just from what Frank said in his presentation, he would say, yes, but no, that's not that important now. No, 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 no. Maybe, but I hope not. And no, and I hope not. In which case, inflation, he will be confident we will deliver inflation. Others in the audience, maybe Hans Helmut or Claudio or Patrizio or Daniel will say, two of these I really want to keep an eye on because I'm just not so sure. And I will be vigilant over the next 6 months, and I will use my public pulpits to warn if I see ECB failing in one of these dimensions to say, let's be very careful here. This is what will lead us to fail. Myself, include, I am on the optimist side. I think the ECB has gained. I'm willing to give a very strong, for a central bank that for 20 years has delivered 2% inflation over through many challenging shocks, I'm willing to give it a very big benefit of the doubt, if you want. And when I look at each of these, I hope that if nothing else through this talk and others, we can contribute to alert the staff at ECB to pay attention to these and not let themselves be too dominated by some of these, while at the same time having the right balancing act and not breaking too many things along the way of the needed bringing down of inflation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. You won't be surprised that the organizers rationally expected that you would come up with very provocative remarks. And they were. So thank you very much for that. Thank you also for the nice summary of your conclusion. What I find particularly remarkable is this dominated by staff. So your first proposition that the underestimation of the neutral rate might really backfire. But then you went on towards fields which have been in practice cases of domination. 2008 and 2009 was, of course, an issue of financial dominance because the interbank market was about to fall apart, and hence actually at that time macroprudential for first time became a policy option for policymakers in the environment of the FSB. Frank doesn't agree, seemingly. So I stop here with summarizing, and maybe I hand over to Claudio to come up with the first question, and then we let come the audience. And Frank, would you like to come in first? Then you have to unmute yourself.
No, I just would like to have a chance to respond. I mean,
yeah, sure,
I think it's a very interesting sort of debate, so to say. But I don't have to.
No, go ahead.
No, I just as a sort of a few reactions. I mean, first of all, and I think at the end discussion sort of clarified this a little bit. I mean, personally, I don't like the narrative of dominances or the inflation of dominances, because it really suggests that, I mean, the central bank should not care about all these considerations. And of course it does. No? So you don't, I mean, I think it's very good that you sort of emphasize these considerations, but that's what the central bank and a flexible inflation targeter does all the time. And again, this is not about trading off 2% against all these other things. It's really about these trade-offs and how fast do you go back to 2%. And so rather than talking about this, and I think all 5 of them as dominances, I think it's really about the trade-offs, as you said. And my fear is when you characterize, when the narrative becomes about dominance, that basically it means that central banks need to become inflation nutters, and should no longer take into account when deciding on how quickly to go back to 2% of these considerations. And again, I can go through each of them and say in each of those cases, and sometimes it will mean that you want to go faster, and in other cases it may mean that you want to go slower. But these considerations are important, and central banks should take them into account. And so in that sense, it's not dominated. It's really a good, flexible inflation targeting to take those considerations into account. And so if I just make a few remarks on and I'm not going to talk about each of them, although I could talk about each of them, because again, I think the great thing about this paper is that it has this list of very important considerations, and we should all be aware of those. And again, I'm pretty convinced that my colleagues at ECB are aware of those. I mean, take the R star. No, of course we know that the uncertainty about R star is very high. No, it's a well-known result, and that it's varying a lot, and that it's not easy to estimate. And that's exactly why people like Orphanides and Williams have suggested we shouldn't rely on simple Taylor rules, which have an estimate of R star, but more think in terms of changing interest rates, not changing policies. And I think in the end, that's what central banks do. They look at what the news is and they adjust interest rates. And part of that news will be how R star or estimates of R star change. And one estimate which I like to look at a lot, or at least put some weight on, is basically what the OIS market, this is not the government bond market. No, so government bonds, they have some specialness, and definitely bonds, for example, have prices have been very different from OIS interest rates at times. But in the OIS market, we have seen, and actually I showed it, the expected R star or real rate, the 1 year real rate, 9 years ahead. So that's really a decade further out. I mean, has increased by 200 basis points. It has gone from basically -2% to 0, which kind of suggests to me, I mean, some people think or thought that the R star was negative in the real. I mean, at least in the financial markets, it's 0, even small positive. I think it's now 0.5%. So and that's really the market that supposedly does the arbitrage for the future policy rate. So I think some of these arguments that you've made hold for if you look at other prices, but I'm not sure it's all that important if you look at the OIS rate forward. And moreover, this is a real-time kind of estimate. Again, there are of course other issues, but I think some of these issues I think are not sort of important for that type of estimates, and it has been changed. The second comment I wanted to make is on yes, about sort of markup shocks. I mean, I don't agree that energy price increases are markup shocks. They're not markup. I mean, they're markup shocks if you have a Phillips curve where there's no energy prices or no production function or anything, then it's just a residual, and you can call that a markup shock. But a permanent increase in imported energy prices because of something that's happened outside of the country, I mean, that's really a negative supply shock, a negative terms of trade shock. So it does lower potential output, and that I mean, to acknowledge that is key. And so again, we shouldn't call inefficient shocks sort of what are really shocks to the efficient level of output. And again, that's important because otherwise you get some of this misjudgment effects. So actually, let me stop here and maybe just say that, I mean, I would argue even for fiscal and financial dominance, which are sort of the more common used terms. Again, I think, of course, it does highlight a situation where price stability could be endangered if the central bank basically is dominated by it. But it does not mean that either fiscal sustainability issues, for example, if they are driven by multiple equilibria, self-fulfilling attacks, should not be an important role in calibrating the stance of policy. Similarly, it does not mean that financial stability issues no, should not be taken into account when, for example, I mean, if you talked about gradualism, that's a counter argument. No, there's reasons if you fear that you're losing credibility, clearly, then you need to, and I think your argument about some expectations being backward looking sort of goes in that way. And so that would argue indeed for being more aggressive and more front loaded and be everything else equal on the tighter side from the neutral part. But similarly, you can argue, no, from a financial stability side, given that we are coming from a period where interest rates have been very low for very long, that it's important to be sort of gradual, I mean, firm, but gradual, so that basically investors, financial markets can adjust, and you don't create the type of sort of self-fulfilling runs that we otherwise might see. Again, it's the task of the policymakers to make that balance, no? And obviously that's where central banking or monetary policy is more of an art than a science. But again, I think if you only talk about these things as dominant rather than as considerations, in our strategy, we call all these things other considerations. I mean, sometimes it's called secondary objectives. And it does not mean that you won't get back to 2%.
Can I say just a couple of things, Hans Zellman, then we open it to the floor? Just two
Sure.
clarifications and then 1 point of, two very quick clarifications. On the R star, Frank, my point is, we don't know where it is. We need to be careful about not falling into misjudgments. As you noted, it seems by some measures, the ones you noted, that have increased 200 basis points. If you increase 200 basis points, then I presume that you would then say that, whereas now you're saying the neutral rate, we should be converging to 2%, 12 months, you say we should be converging to 0%. But the key point is to understand that, look, as you update upwards, it must update upwards also where you think you're going to end up. And so, yeah, so that's just my only point, is that this thing moves around, it's uncertain, and therefore you have to be adjusting. And therefore, if you evaluate it up and down. Second, I agree that I'm very happy to defer on not calling them markup shocks, because in the end, what you said matches exactly what I wrote in the slides, which is the fear is when you're trying to push for an output that is not there in potential, that you think that you can avoid the recession, and that's essentially which the misjudgment comes. But those are very two small racks. But on the dominance, let me defend why I use the word dominance, Frank, on what you call trade-offs, while agreeing with everything you said, and thus me talking about what I call the balancing act and which you call trade-offs. The key is that I start the presentation by saying, I want to imagine where we're going to be 2 years from now. And again, I'm happy to give you 3 years if you don't like 2 years, by the way. And so I ask, when is it that in 2 years, in a medium run, if you want, you may not be hitting your inflation target? And if you want, and a completely fair representation of what I just said in the last half hour is to say, you will not be on target in 2 or 3 years' time because you put so much weight into what you call other considerations, neglecting that those other considerations are important for the short run, for the transition, but in the medium run, the primacy of price stability is given by the Maastricht Treaty. In other words, I think the key thing here is the horizon. In a 6-month horizon, all of these points not all, some of the points that I mentioned are exactly the trade-offs that are just, as you rightly put, Ricardo, what are you talking about? It's just flexible average inflation targeting. But the key thing is, and what I surely rushed through, is the consideration of 2-3 years from now. And again, you can say what are legitimate trade-offs in a 12, 24-month horizon start being dominance if they keep on pushing policy to delay, and to let inflation go out of hand in 2 to 3 years' times. That is the sense in which many of those arguments, although not all, I think you're being ungenerous when you say all of them, but the vast majority of them are indeed trade-offs that become dominant. Why? Insofar as they are short-run trade-offs that ultimately start dominating the medium run when would be delivered at 2%. So that's why, Frank, I like using my words dominance, because it's about the horizon. Meaning nothing of what I said was to say one should ignore a fiscal crisis in the next couple of months and so on. The question is, can we, and again, take a 3-year horizon. I'm talking here always about 2024. If we end up with inflation at 4%, and we ask ourselves, why did that happen? And I think we would agree that would have been a failure. Was it because we worried too much about financial fiscal considerations in the process over and over and over to the point where we sacrifice masters. And that's why I think I like the word dominance, but maybe I haven't convinced you, but that's just why I'm using it. And that's why it's completely consistent with the other considerations that you were saying. The considerations are it's a difference between a short run and a medium run, at least in my way, in the way I'm thinking. So at least I have to clarify that. And again, feel free to tell me why you find it still confusing.
Yeah, I don't want to make this a bilateral discussion, but just one a short. I mean, part of the choice is the horizon. No, so I don't think you can pick the horizon as, because exactly all these considerations that you talk about will determine the optimal horizon. And it's not that I'm arguing we just have to postpone and we have a very long transition. No, you just, because some of these arguments would suggest a very short transition. And if that's the analysis, if that's what kind of is the more important consideration, then that's what you need to do. And again, I have no doubt that when the consideration is about credibility, that central banks will indeed try to get inflation back very, very, very quickly. So the horizon is really, that's a one-to-one with the flexibility. No, that's really the margin of flexibility.
But then if you don't want 2 years, you tell me the number. I'll do it 4 if you want. I will write the whole paper. And
no, it's not fixed. That's the thing.
End of 2026.
It's not fixed. It depends on your assessment of some of these other considerations. And of course, the higher you are from your target, I mean, now at 10%, I mean, obviously there's not much room to be very, very lax. So I mean, you want to bring it back because otherwise some of these measures. But it's very state contingent. That's and the state contingency depends on all those factors which you usually highlight.
I'll repeat my point and then we open the floor. I want to ask, if we are sitting here in 2025 in this lovely conference, I hope Claudio.
But there will be so many other things that will have happened.
Come on, guys. Come on,
then
Ricardo. No, it might be more than semantics. I like the way Frank put it into the context of flexible inflation targeting and state contingent. But it could be also a medium run issue. Just let's think about spread widening. Let's think about fiscal situations deteriorating. So couldn't it be the case then that monetary policy would be really in a bind? So I
didn't want to say that sort of the notion of fiscal dominance or financial is useless. No, it does. But what I was trying to
I liked it, but my point, Frank,
the inflation of dominances.
Sorry for interrupting you, Frank. The issue is that we are talking here about the average of the euro area, which is not acknowledging a dispersion in terms, in particular, fiscal capacity across the euro area. If we have a substantial fall in output, responses might be rather different and hence lead to structural spread widening. So I guess that's somehow the concern of Ricardo also. You're muted, and I stopped there.
No, I agree. Again, I'm not trying to minimize these considerations, these concerns. No, I'm just arguing that there's an inflation of dominances, and that really what in most of the cases we're talking about is really about the trade-offs, and choosing the optimal horizon to get inflation back to 2% without any if I look at our constitution without any prejudice to the dominant, the primary objective of getting inflation back to 2%.
Sounds very good. I guess we could now hand over to the audience. Or Claudio, will you?